The first few minutes are filled with music to put everybody in a good mood. I'm just coming off of another Zoom. Unfortunately, a difficult topic, but we'll still wait for folks to join. A difficult topic being the elections in Israel, my friends. Bad news, like really, really bad news. And happy to talk about that another time, perhaps. But difficult times, and times to remind ourselves of how much work there still is to be done, and how and to fix it. I was on a call with a group of rabbis, mostly North Americans, but some Israelis as well. What are the things that need to be done? One of the things that need to be done in general for all of what we do, at least from my point of view, from a liberal progressive point of view, is that it's not all about campaigns. Campaigns, of course, about one issue or another are important, but it's building the foundations for those campaigns to work. The foundations of language in which people can speak together towards understanding, and that's what we're doing. This is not a campaign. What we're doing here in our little study group here, this is it may be a course that's wrapped around the book of Acts of Apostles, but what we're doing in essence is trying to understand the other, and to build that capacity for getting through difficult times and helping others who are less fortunate than we are, to have these opportunities to get them past. And that's how I'm feeling about Israel right now, today, just 2 days after a devastating election, with unfortunately now the news in that one of the most important, from my point of view, the most important political party, not the most influential, the most important political party, will not make it into this Knesset. That is Meretz. And in preparing myself for next week's election results as well. Okay, so
wow,
not something that a lot of folks think about. Even in Oram Midbar, I'm not sure people are aware that there was an election, but we haven't had a Shabbat yet. No, and this week is Pride Interfaith Friday night, so I won't be talking about it then, but there'll be more about it in the weeks to come, of course. Okay, so would you like to because I'm still a little bit distracted from this, and I'm a bit emotional as well. Steve, would you kind of lead us off in the study for today, please?
sure. So my prayer for all of us is that we would all take deep breaths and empty ourselves of preconceived notions and ideas that sometimes keep us from paying attention. And my prayer is that we would be open to surprise, to being surprised by each other, by the text. And that, as David said, my prayer is that we would use this opportunity as a chance to build deeper roots, not only within our own souls, but with this community gathered on this screen, that we might reveal something important about who God is in what we say and do. And David, also our prayers go out to you personally, asking that the ones you love and the things you care about will survive to live another day, so that you can go with the givens as they are, and hopefully bring them some good.
Today.
Amen. Okay, jump in at any time, everybody, but let me just set a real quick framework around this text, chapter 12. If you'll recall, this so far in our study, we have traced, according to the community of Luke. And again, I've said this before, I think this community was centered in Antioch. And as we saw at the end of last week, Antioch has become central to this Jewish Christian mission to the Gentile outsiders, to the other. And this mission gets changed along the way, even as it changes others. But in the beginning, when they were all gathered in Jerusalem, in Judea, and continuing temple observance, they were in fact getting pushback by those so-called conservative Hellenistic Jews who came in and sided with the Sadducees, the keepers of the temple, to go after Stephen and the Hellenistic speaking Jewish leaders, and they were all kicked out. Stephen was killed, as we read, and then the others, like Philip, were dispersed, were thrown out. The Hebrew speaking or Aramaic speaking Jews in Judea remained safe, right? Peter, James, John, the apostles, the Hebrew Jews in Jerusalem were not touched by this purge against the Hellenistic speaking Jewish Christians like Stephen. Now that changes. Today, for the first time, we see that even the Hebrew speaking, Aramaic speaking Jews are also being attacked. And they're being attacked in today's story by Herod Agrippa. This is the grandson of Herod the Great, who most Christians understand every Christmas when the story of the birth of Jesus is told and Herod was ruling. So this is now, this is the grandson, and Herod Agrippa is he's known as a good friend of the Jewish people. And he's also, he now rules several districts in Roman-controlled Israel and Palestine. He now controls at the bidding of Claudius, the emperor. And he begins to get uncomfortable with this expanding Jewish Christian movement, and especially the rumors that are being thrown around that these Jewish Christians are letting in the other, the Gentile outsider, and not requiring them to become Jews through circumcision, that they're giving them access to the covenant between God and God's people, but without requiring them to also become Jewish, despite their belief in Jesus as Messiah. So just to put this together, and then we'll open it up and get into the text itself. I just want you to kind of get into this context so that we'll hear it as it's being read. But the rumors of the laxity towards the Gentiles is disturbing Jewish insiders. At first, it was just the Sadducees, the keepers of the temple, but now with when Herod Agrippa, he had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword, and when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he goes and arrests Peter. And that's where we'll begin today. But just note that now Herod, who's a friend of the Pharisees, a friend of the lay movement of rabbis, and again, my assumption is that the book of Acts was written in the form we now have it after the destruction of the temple. So things are changing within Judaism. It's in turmoil, and there's layers and layers of Jewish belief and law observance, and the permission that Rome gave the Jews to worship as they pleased without interference from Rome. That was a special dispensation. That's now at risk, because if the Jewish people are now becoming more dispersed, or if there's more heterogeneity, if there's inclusion of Gentiles and other non-observant Jews into the community, it appears to dilute the identity of what it means to be Jewish. And with that dilution comes vulnerability. Will they continue to be able to worship as they please, or will they now be forced to come under more compliance through Rome? So Herod Agrippa is a friend of the Pharisaic movement. He wants to protect Judaism, or the Jewish community, against the perceived threat of its dilution or the weakening of its identity. And so that's the setting that we have. Any questions about that or comments before we actually read it?
No. Thanks, Steve, for giving the historical framework. I would like to give it maybe a little bit of a counterbalance to that, as far as from a literary point of view. When you look at this chapter, and assuming that the final editor of this book, was presenting something, one sees the name Herod and not Herod Agrippa. And it seems to me that would be in order for people to say, oh, we've been there before. We know that Herod who's out to get us, who was out to get little Jesus, right? Mm-hmm. And I think even though the people reading this understand it's a historically different character, a different person, I think that it's replicating or coming back. There've been so many things that we've seen in the last few chapters that have brought us back to the Jesus story as well. In other words, there's this ongoing. I don't want to say christening, or this ongoing persecution of our people. And what I said in no way contradicts what you said. It's just a different approach of looking at it. So why don't we get into it then, if nobody has any other comments or questions?
Great. Tom Bonnell, are you out there?
I'm here.
Good. Tom, would you read for us the first 11 verses? Acts 12 verses 1 to 11.
Sure. James killed and Peter in prison, right there.
Right.
Okay. About that time, King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword. After he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the festival of unleavened bread. When he had seized him, he put him in prison and handed him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending to bring him out to the people after the Passover. While Peter was kept in prison, the church prayed fervently to God for him.
And then the next paragraph.
Sure. The very night before Herod was going to bring him out, Peter, bound with 2 chains, was sleeping between 2 soldiers, while guards in front of the door were keeping watch over the prison. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He tapped Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his wrists. The angel said to him, "Fasten your belt and put on your sandals." He did so. Then he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." Peter went out and followed him. He did not realize that the first and the second guard, they came before the iron gate leading into the city. After they had passed the first and the second guard, they came before the iron gate. It opened for them and of its own accord, and they went outside and walked along a lane. Suddenly the angel left them. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I'm sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hands of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting."
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Sure.
What pops out? What grabs you? What raises a good question in your mind?
One of the things that occurs to me is wrap your cloak around you and follow me. Is this the robe that Jesus wore? Is that what this is? But I don't know. Down in 12, there are some interesting things that struck me there. Announced that Peter was standing at the gate. I like this, you are, to the woman, you are out of your mind. Quite vivid. I'm wondering what that would be in Greek.
Well, Tom, we'll get to that in a sec. Let's look at these first 11 verses before we do.
Absolutely.
But yeah, you're getting to the punchline, and which we'll finish up in just a second.
Okay.
But Don, what's your hand for?
My hand is up because James was an apostle, and his murder was kind of different from the murder of Stephen or the stoning of Stephen. But that struck me as a turning point here in Acts. But because James is getting it because he is a, quote, Christian, whereas Stephen's murder was more against the law and against the ruling authorities of.
Well, yeah, good point, Don. I think you're right.
Steve, I have a question. You mentioned Herod Agrippa, and then there is this Herod, King Herod mentioned here, and somewhere I have read about Herod the Great. Are those all three different people, or are they all the same person?
Well, they're different, right? I mean, they're the Roman appointed governors or puppet kings, if you will, to rule on behalf of Rome as Jews, right? But Herod the Great was the granddaddy, and
Okay.
So
So,
do you have a thought to that, or David, do you want to add to it?
Ajit, my point before was that even though everybody knew this was not Herod the Great, this was the grandson or the third generation, that the text, the author here uses just Herod. First of all, that would have been used like kind of a Caesar kind of a thing. But Herod, in order to connect us from a literary point of view, connect us to the original, the Jesus trying to kill before or just when he's born story. Did anybody notice when this is happening?
Passover.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I know that people's natural tendency is says, "Oh, it must have happened on Passover," but I think it's a little bit more I think it's also a literary device, other than the fact perhaps it did happen on Passover, but what are the words that were emphasized? You asked about the cloak. I think the cloak is connected to another. What else is mentioned here, which isn't really relevant to the story? What you think? What details kind of
Fasten your belt and put on your sandals.
Yeah, like duh.
It's a
Why-
Passover motif.
Exactly. One eats the Paschal lamb with your belt on and with your sandals on, which is counterintuitive, right? It's part of the story, it's part of the practice. This is a reliving. If the Herod part of this is reliving the baby Jesus story, this is reliving the Exodus from Egypt story, even though it's not about Egypt per se. And again, what I love about these texts is that the author and the editor or the redactor, whoever it is alighting upon all these major themes that connect it with the experience, I'll just say, of being Jewish, but the experience of these religious experiences, and the Exodus of the escape from slavery, so to speak, was not only a historical fact, it's something that happens in time and time again. In this case, with the heroes, but it also bring it back to ourselves with everybody. There's always something to escape from. So I would say, Tom, my guess would be the cloak is part of that as well. But,
helpful, David. Thank you.
There's something going around in my head that's elusive, but I think the reliving Jesus part and Judaism in the scriptures is something that is very well connected for the benefit of the two traditions.
and how would that play out?
It plays out in
Or how would it play out?
but it gives a comfort from one source to two traditions. So it's, it's hooked together by these dual interpretations of passages as we dive into them and get a sense of what they mean.
It reminds me, Don, in my own personal life of interfaith dialogue, which is really only the last 20 years, since 2001. I was invited to a conference in Qatar, and they asked me to speak on, what it might look like, this kind of productive, productive dialogue, what we're doing today. And so I chose the topic of the binding of Isaac in the three different traditions, or the binding of the son of Abraham in the three different traditions, and it was a text study. And the idea was to, first of all, to emphasize the commonality, but then to take the next step. Okay, so, and how are we different? What do we learn about ourselves? How do we learn more about ourselves in comparing ourselves to that other common thing? That's one way to go. That's one way to go with this. The other way is what you just said wisely, is that it first and foremost, it provides comfort or maybe even some hope, in sharing these traditions.
Thank you for calling me wise, but I'm not.
Stephen, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was going to ask, what was Herod planning to do with Peter after Passover? Because it says, he's going to bring him out. He's keeping him there until that's done. And then at the end, it talks about the angel rescuing him from the hands of Herod and all that the Jewish people were expecting. Is he like a scapegoat, or what's going on there?
Well, it's a real nice question. I think we start with verse 3. After he saw that it pleased the Jews, he's a politician, right? And he's trying to galvanize his support, and all of Judea is in turmoil. You still have incursions from zealots who are trying to take Rome down. Rome is on edge. The Jewish people are on edge, getting ready to just try to figure out who are we now? What is our identity given the loss of our temple and all else? And who are these upstarts who are taking our name or our tradition and co-opting it for their own? Is there something there? I think it's just all swirling. And so when he sees that it pleases the Jews, he's got Peter arrested. He's got a lot of guard. It's overkill, the protection, but I think he's going to make a show trial of some kind, to make the point, to secure whatever advantage it gives him.
This was his third arrest too. I mean, he was arrested twice before this, and I think he would have gotten killed were it not for Passover.
Mm-hmm.
And they kind of put him in a cold storage unit waiting for the Passover celebration to be finished. And then they were going to get at him, but the angel appeared and freed him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Terry?
So I like this. I really appreciated the comment about putting on your belt and your cloak, which didn't, I mean, that's something that is a very Jewish kind of idea, but didn't strike me. But I think that's partly why Peter almost, it says he came to himself. It's almost like he thought he was dreaming. And I know if you're really in a tense situation, you dream ahead of time about, and it usually goes wrong in your dream, but you're trying to get out, you're trying to do something. But it says he came to himself and he realized it wasn't a dream. This really happened and I'm out of prison. And I liked that. I like that image of the angel leading him through and he's thinking he's dreaming.
Nice.
Great,
And you're right. It ends with Stephen's question, rescued me from the hands of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting, which, Stephen, I never really answered that, but it seems to me that it's, to kill him, like he did with James, the brother of John. And because that solidifies his support among his people. And would it have been a death blow to the early Jewish Christian movement? Hard to say what's at stake at this point, but yeah, it definitely resonates with Passover. It resonates with Jesus's escape to Egypt from Herod in the birth narrative. It's got this otherworldly, surrealistic, dreamy, miraculous, supernatural ethos, this quality. I mean, this is almost like a meditation. If you can just put yourself in Peter's position and psychologically just do a thought experiment and see if, just a good meditation at the least. But it's very literarily fascinating and powerful. I don't know, Terry, if I interrupted what you were after, but you reminded me of that earlier question.
Terry, thanks for the comment about the dreaming and the pinching. It's Peter pinches himself, right? That brings me to Psalm 126, in the words, we were as if we were in a dream, says the psalmist, and that's a psalm about salvation, about the people coming back to the land. It's a post-exilic psalm. It's one of the later psalms that we have, and it's a psalm about salvation. And it says, and we were as if we were dreamers. I think that's probably the most common translation, as if we were dreamers. In other words, we're pinching ourselves. We don't believe it's true. I wouldn't put it past the author here, and this would mean going back to the Greek and checking to see what the Septuagint says in the Psalms as well, that's also a purposeful and intentional allusion here, right?
Mm.
This is a mini salvation going on here, if I can use that word.
David, where do you see that?
Where do I see where in Psalm 126?
The exact thing that you see going back to the Psalm? I mean, what do you see in this passage?
That that Peter thought he was in a dream.
Okay.
Too good to be true.
Yeah. Yes.
Are we really out of exile?
All right, back to today. Some of us are pinching ourselves, hoping that the Israeli elections were a dream.
Yes.
That's the other side of it.
Wait till next Tuesday.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's finish with this section, verses 12 to 19. Will someone finish that?
I'll read it, Steve.
Okay.
As soon as he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many had gathered and were praying. When he knocked at the outer gate, a maid named Rhoda came to answer. On recognizing Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the gate, she ran in and announced that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she insisted that it was so. They said, "It is his angel." Meanwhile, Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the gate, they saw him and were amazed. He motioned to them with his hand to be silent and described for them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And he added, "Tell this to James and to the brothers and sisters." Then he left and went to another place. When morning came, there was no small commotion among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. When Herod had searched for him and could not find him, he examined the guards and ordered them to be put to death. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there.
Nice.
I've got a question on this, if I might. When it says it is his angel, what is that? Is that, the idea that it would be someone's angel? The Greek word is angelos, which means to announce. What is the context here?
I think that means, in subsequent religious thought, that everyone has a guardian angel. It's like the beginning of guardian angelship.
Mhm. And maybe that was a contemporary understanding as well. I'm not sure about that.
I kind of go to Daniel on this, Daniel being the latest of the Hebrew scriptures, and the development of that kind of an angel, a personal, yeah.
A guardian.
Yeah, a guardian interpreter, kind of almost, liaison, yeah.
Between the individual and God.
Yeah.
Could
it also be just an indication that they were telling her that she was dreaming, that she was seeing a vision of Peter, but not him in the flesh?
Seems like it.
This strikes me, going back to Hannah and Eli, when he accused her of being drunk and mumbling in her prayer. I don't know why that struck me in reading that passage, but that's what I thought of. She didn't even acknowledge Peter when he came. She just ran back to the group. She just left him standing there, but she was excited enough to tell the group that he arrived.
Yeah, and they seem to go out of their way to say
Yeah.
this is not just a vision. This happened, much like in the early Jewish Christians insisting that resurrection was bodily, that it wasn't just a projection of our wishful thinking. There something concrete really happened. They seem to be suggesting that no, it's real.
Steve, does that tie in? And I can't remember if it's the Gospel of John where it said, put your finger in my in my hand, and you can see that, this is real. It's not just an illusion,
Mhm.
does that go back
Yeah,
into
I think
that?
in that same spirit, for sure. Jim and Terry, y'all had a thought?
My comment was, women were not credible witnesses. So if she says, I saw something, this Peter's there, they're going to say, you're out of your mind. She wouldn't be, she just wouldn't be a credible witness.
Mhm.
I also have a question
She was a
about,
maid. She was a maid, Terry. She was a maid.
well, yeah, that too. She had a couple strikes against her. My question, he added, tell this to James and to the brothers and sisters. I'm assuming that James is Jesus's brother James and those brothers and sisters. I wasn't totally sure on that one.
Right. I think so. And fascinating. Tell this to James and to the brothers and sisters. Then he left and went to another place. Where did he go? We don't really hear from Peter again. And I mean, he fades pretty much out of the scene at this point. At least I can't think of where he pops back in. So where did he go? It's very interesting. And now, of course, all the gravity shifts over to the end of this chapter with Barnabas and Saul. And then the next chapters will be focused on Paul and his mission.
There's an interesting comparison to be made between the lives of Peter and Paul. If you lay certain events side by side, you see they track each other pretty much,
Mm-hmm.
which to me is strange.
Mm-hmm.
Steve,
Any other
would there
thoughts,
be
David?
Yeah, would there be any comparison here? I also was struck by the female characters here and how that works. Would there be comparisons to stories in the Gospels with Jesus as well in his interaction with the women? That's a genuine question. I have no idea.
Well, yeah, it seems like it. Like when Terry said women were not credible, then I immediately think of the women who were the first to discover the empty tomb, and so they're in that privileged position, even though they are not initially believed, or at least their credibility was suspect for whatever reason. So I guess so, David. I don't.
And then my question would be for myself in my own studies. So if this motif is coming up in the New Testament from time to time, I don't know if it comes up more often, but what does that have to say about rabbinic literature, in which the place of women in their experience, their spiritual and theological experiences is very limited in rabbinic literature. There's one or two exceptions that everybody talks about, but they're exactly that, they're exceptions. Rabbi Meir's wife, Bruria, there's a few stories, but so what does that mean? At the same time, in rabbinic circles, is there something for us to learn from early Christianity in its semi-egalitarianism, in its gender equality? I don't know. These are open.
I think definitely so, and we'll see that as Acts unfolds with Lydia and Philippi, for example. But yeah, I mean, what you say just immediately recalls, Paul's famous one-liner in Christ. There's neither Jew or Gentile, male or female, slave or free. He kind of transcends those binaries and puts them on an equal footing, it seems. So
if I could add some comment on this, my view is that Christianity here, where we are reading, is in its formative stages. They're still struggling to define themselves and decide who a Christian is.
Mhm.
Compared to the Jewish faith, which has existed for centuries and has certain things set in place, almost some things that have been set in concrete. And the role of women there has become defined as the role of women in Christianity will become defined in the year 325 or 390 or whenever Christianity develops structures. So this is a very fluid situation, and the role of women is still being understood, defined, clarified, etc.
Yeah, well said. And for example, like when Paul speaks in or Paul, the community that is attributed to Paul for the letter to the Ephesians, you know, he uses the Aristotelian household code to talk about men and women's roles in the community, in the Greco-Roman world. And so wives, submit to your husbands, for example. But then he subverts all of that in his closer where he says, submit to one another, men and women. You know, he just throws that in, which was very radical and subversive in terms of that acknowledged common household role relationship. But of course, as you pointed out, Ajit, in later centuries, Christians read that, pull it out of context, and create rigid roles for men and women in the church, right? And miss the context that made Paul's original statement so illuminating, so radical.
Shall we move on?
Yeah. Who'll finish us? From verse 20 to 25.
Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, so they came to him in a body, and after winning over Blastus, the king's personal attendant, they asked for reconciliation because their country depended on the king's country for food. On an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took his seat on the platform, and delivered a public address to them. The people kept shouting, "The voice of a god and not of a mortal." And immediately, because he had not given the glory to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. But the word of God continued to advance and gain adherents. Then, after completing their mission, Barnabas and Saul returned to Jerusalem and brought with them John, whose other name was Mark.
David, you want to riff on that with
You gotta love the worms, right? I mean, you know,
yeah.
it's not enough that he died. He died a long, agonizing death. You know, and also it just this paragraph just shouts out, you know, geopolitical maneuvering over wars and grain and oil and gas and things that are, you know, it's kind of the story's been going on for centuries, right? For thousands of years.
Non sequiturs.
Yeah. Well, we always like to get, despite turning the other cheek, everybody, we always like to get our revenge. And this is something quite Jewish. Something went on. Oh, it was a difficult time, and one of my really good friend, Rev Kev, many of you know, UCC minister here in Palm Springs. So he said to me, we're having an intimate conversation. I said, well, you know what? They deserve that. A group that had done something not nice to me. And he says, now, remember what our tradition says about turning the other cheek? I said, no, Kev, that's your tradition. We don't have that. We relish in revenge. We want to get our revenge, you know. So I say that with a grain of salt, and I think some of you know better what I'm talking about. That there needs to be this poetic justice. So then you ask yourself, but why worms? Where do the worms come from?
I have a question.
Sure.
Maybe it's because I'm an accountant and I like order,
Yeah,
but it's that he was knocked down. Then he was eaten by worms, and then he died. Wouldn't he have been knocked down, eaten by worms? The order is wrong. He was struck down. Well, he's eaten by worms first, and then he died. Wouldn't he have died and then been eaten by worms?
Yeah.
right. So it depends where the worms are. I think this is where I brought a parallel of the parallel source from Josephus.
And the other question before we even go on, the other is he's sitting on the platform. Did this all happen within moments, or were they all watching this, or were they all sitting there in an audience for 3 months while he's being eaten by worms?
So it depends where the worms are, right? Are the worms in the ground or are the worms in his kishkas? For those of you in Texas that are not familiar with the word kishka, Ajit, is that a word you use, kishka?
Yes,
Okay.
I have heard it used before.
It's an international, it's your gut, right? I think that the idea here were the worms that he was eaten. He was plagued by something, by a very painful death of whatever, dysentery, something that was concerned with the gut. I think those are the worms that they're talking about here, and you can read on your own the passage from Josephus, or the other passages on the next page that show that that's out there, that this vengeance, this heavenly vengeance comes in the form of worms. My immediate thought in reading this was to go to a rabbinic legend about Titus, or Titus, I guess you say Titus, who was attributed to be the one who actually went in rabbinic legend, who went into the temple in the destruction and desecrated the altar by spreading a Torah scroll over the altar and doing it with 2 prostitutes on the altar, right? That's rabbinic imagination, fantasies, I guess, twisted fantasies. And the punishment was that a mosquito flew into his nose and began to settle down in his brain and would hack away at his brain until he eventually, after years, right, went crazy from the hacking of this mosquito that it was gnawing away. This horrible death, long death. To me, that's what these worms were. That's the parallel, the literary parallel.
Can you explain this? The people kept shouting the voice of a God and not a mortal. What does that refer to?
Well, if you look in the parallel from Josephus, this seems to be a story that was out there. Whether it happened this way or not, that's a literary topos that at some point people felt that Agrippa's it went to his head. His power went to his head, and he began to say he himself was a god. It's drawn out far more, the story in Josephus. It's the same story. That doesn't necessarily mean it happened, but it means that story was out there. And in the context of that story is placed here, and it's secondary in our source here. It's secondary here in order to tell us that, oh, he thought he was going to screw with us, excuse my language, he was going to mess with us, with the early church. God showed him, we showed him, right? God showed him. That's not the way it's going to happen. And that's why it's important to see it in the context of the liberation from slavery, from bondage as well, because that God can do. You think you can bind our, but no, God can liberate in such a way. And in some ways, Agrippa, Herod is cast here as Pharaoh, right? It's Pharaoh getting his punishment, kind of a thing. That's how I read it. Maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, but that's what it did to me, this chapter.
But it also does make that important theological point against idolatry, right? Remember earlier they were trying to worship Peter after that healing earlier, and he said, no, I'm just a man. What are you doing? And so there is something related to a radical statement against idolatry, which I think is in the warp and woof of Judaism as well. So
I think, Don, you wanted to say?
Yeah,
sorry.
I'm sorry. I'll yield to Megan.
Okay, this is just short, but I sort of see this coming in the first, when he puts Peter in prison, then he's going to bring him out after, quote, Passover, I wasn't thinking he was going to put him to trial, put him to death and all that. I was thinking he's going to be like here's your Peter. There's something that he was working himself up to look like a god, but they prayed to the church to save him, and God did come in with the angel and save Peter. It wasn't because the Herods were, at least from what I've read, they killed everybody, their wives, their sisters, their so, and then all the guards were killed who didn't guard him. So then it comes down, there was really like as you were saying, Rabbi David, the worms were in his gut. That he was working himself up to be a king god versus I don't know. It's just how I was reading it.
That whole idea goes against the grain of being Jewish, that a mortal human being who this guy is would be working himself to a god. I mean, I can see pagans calling themselves pagan, Egyptians calling themselves kings, calling themselves God. I cannot imagine someone who is Jewish as in power ever thinking of himself as a god. That just goes against the grain of what it means to be Jewish. This is somewhat confusing for me here.
And of course, there's an irony, dare I say, the irony here is, of course, is that in the Jesus story, there's a Jewish person who is calling himself, or is being called, both a king and God.
Mhm.
And there's a little bit of irony there that needs to be worked out. I'm not sure exactly how.
Rabbi, there is a strong statement from Jesus. And he says, why callest thou me good? There is no one good but our Father who is in heaven. He just denies that he is in fact God in that statement. So, no, he does not call himself God. His followers may have called him God.
I meant to say his followers, of course,
Yeah.
yes. I think, Jim, I think you had something to say?
But just historically, Herod reigned at the pleasure of Caesar. And Caesars were considered to be gods as well. So it seems to me that, just kind of natural that he would assume that also, especially when the people, revered him as such.
It could be a small g.
A small god.
Yeah, small g.
Little god.
Yeah, in the Jewish literary tradition, another foreign leader who felt himself, who was perceived to be calling himself a god, was Antiochus Epiphanes. And that's in the Maccabees too. If you look at the bottom sheet, the similar, that's why I was very guarded about saying whether this really happened this way, if this is a historical fact or not. But it's out there as a literary topos. When the king who calls himself a god, what happens to him? If you look in 2 Maccabees at the bottom, and so the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms. That's about Antiochus Epiphanes, ungodly because in the words of the author of 2nd Maccabees, of course he was calling himself a god, but in reality he was ungodly. And while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away, and because of the stench of the whole army. In other words, it's the most disgusting kind of. It's not being killed in battle. And in Judith before that, that's just out there again as a literary topos, that's what happens to the angry, the fire and worms in their flesh. And then finally, I'm going back upwards, you'll see that the story is drawn out in Josephus as to how he saw himself a god, and then he was rewarded, so to speak, or punished with that kind of a death. Yes, Don.
I wondered to myself why James was beheaded and Peter got away. And I'm reminded of something that I learned when I lived at Providence Place in Holyoke, which is a mother house for the Sisters of Providence. I lived there a little more than 2 years. And these people, the sisters, of course, are in their 90s. 80s and 90s, and they have a community of about 20 people left. But what permeates their life is the phrase "God is in control" and providence. They don't say God, they say providence is in control. And you get that sense of that communication coming into your soul when you're around the sisters. And when I see why James got it and why Peter didn't get it, I'm wondering, God acts in funny ways, at least in the scriptures. But God is in control and is in control of our systems and our lives also. Not a fatalistic control, but a divine plan control.
Jim?
Well, I have a question that we haven't discussed yet. Josephus here in his history talks about an owl, that Herod looked up and he saw this owl that at one time bid good things for him. And now the owl, he recognizes is bringing ill tidings to him. Where's the owl come from? And what's that mean? And where'd Josephus get that?
A great question, and a question I asked myself as well. Had I been at home, I would have looked at my Low Classic Library edition to see if there was a comment there, but I'm not at home, and so that's something to look up. I don't know. Steve, know anything about owls and in that culture? Obviously, another kind of an angel, right? The owl is an angelic figure of sorts, right? Another messenger of God. But I wonder the same thing, and I'll try to look it up and give you an answer next week.
Well, it's Athena. I mean, it's Athena, and of course the idea there is wisdom. That's basically it's fairly limited, but it is tied into the goddess Athena.
Ah, thank you.
Nice. Well, David, I think your comment about the irony of he presumed to be what's the exact language? The voice of a god and not of a mortal. And immediately, because he had not given the glory to God, he was struck down by an angel of the Lord. I think that's clearly in a self-conscious phrasing. I think the irony that you pointed out, where they now move to worship Jesus as the incarnate one, as God in the flesh. And again, that understanding wasn't fully realized until later, but it's implicit, it's here. And so I think in these upcoming stories, and maybe even starting with next week, we'll have a chance to drill down into that a little bit more, because I think that could be fruitful.
Okay, any further parting comments?
My only parting comment is that last verse, then after completing their mission, Barnabas and Saul returned to Jerusalem and brought with them John, whose other name was Mark. So that's a nice segue into next week, where those three and their retinue go on their so-called first journey into Asia Minor.
Is this setting up in some ways the Gospel of Mark? Is this supposed to be a lead into that?
There's I think a fairly reliable tradition that John Mark, at least the community of folks that emerged from him, was the community that penned the first gospel. So that's a reliable tradition, but it's hard to say from a purely scholarly point of view. But it's a great story. And as we'll see next week, John Mark bails on them. He goes back to Jerusalem, and Paul accuses him of being kind of disloyal, and Paul and Barnabas then fight, and they split up over that. So the plot thickens for sure.
So Steve, if you could clarify, are we saying that the Mark or John, other name was Mark, is the same Mark who has a gospel of Mark named after him?
I'm not saying that, but there are reliable, I think, plausible traditions that make that case.
Okay.
And maybe next week when we look at John Mark, I can share that with you briefly, but
Okay.
it's fascinating.
Mhm.
So I want to end with how I personally began, in that there on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, which is the morning the destruction of the temple, which is in the background of what we're reading now. You're not supposed to study. You're not supposed to study Torah at all. Only the stories about the destruction. And the reason for that is that when you study Torah, whatever it is, you find comfort. Things look a little bit brighter. And so I feel totally different than I did at the beginning of this hour, after we've studied Torah together, and Torah in the widest sense of the word. And it does give me a glimpse of hope for the days coming, after at least my own personal experience of this Israeli election. So may we all be healthy. May everybody vote, however you're going to vote. And may we be optimistic next Thursday. All right, everybody. Thanks for being here.
Thank you all.
Thank you.